China's military is supposed to be the weak link. That's the story you've probably heard for years. China's economy is slowing. Its military lacks combat experience. Its equipment hasn't been tested in major modern wars. The United States still spends more on defense than the next several countries combined. And yet, while that story was being repeated, something else was happening. The Chinese military began deploying technologies that many American analysts expected to arrive much later. Not concepts, not prototypes, not PowerPoint slides shown at defense conferences. Actual systems entering service. That should make people stop for a second, because this video isn't about whether China can defeat the United States in a war. That's a different question entirely. It's about something more immediate. What happens when a country many observers still describe as catching up starts fielding capabilities ahead of schedule? The distinction matters. A lot of military discussions treat technology like a scoreboard. One side has more advanced equipment, therefore it wins. History is full of governments that discovered reality works differently. The French army entered World War II with impressive equipment on paper. The Soviet Union possessed enormous numbers of tanks in 1941. America spent trillions in Afghanistan and still failed to achieve its political objectives. Military power isn't a collection of gadgets. It's a system. And right now, China's system is evolving at a pace that has forced even some of its harshest critics to revise earlier assumptions. Take hypersonic weapons. Back in 2021, reports emerged that China had tested a fractional orbital bombardment system combined with a hypersonic glide vehicle. The headlines focused on the weapon itself. I think the more important question was different. How did they get there? Because whenever people discuss Chinese military technology, the conversation usually begins at the final product, the missile, the ship, the aircraft. The real story begins years earlier, in factories, supply chains, research institutes, semiconductor facilities, and industrial parks most people have never heard of. That is where the balance is quietly shifting. Consider shipbuilding. China's commercial shipbuilding industry produces more vessels annually than the United States can realistically match in the foreseeable future. That industrial base doesn't just build cargo ships. It creates skilled labor, steel production capacity, logistics networks, component suppliers, and manufacturing expertise that can support naval expansion. Military capability doesn't emerge from thin air. It emerges from ecosystems. The uncomfortable implication is that a country doesn't necessarily need better engineers than everyone else. It may simply need enough engineers, enough factories, enough suppliers, and enough coordination to move faster than its competitors. Speed matters, sometimes more than elegance. The Pentagon understands this, which is why recent defense reports have increasingly focused on China's defense industrial base rather than treating every new weapon as an isolated development. There's a reason for that concern. A new fighter jet can be copied. A manufacturing ecosystem is much harder to replicate. And this is where the conversation becomes interesting, because many people still imagine military competition the way it worked during the Cold War. Two superpowers racing to invent the next breakthrough. The emerging reality looks different. Increasingly, the race is about who can scale technologies first, who can produce them faster, who can integrate them faster, who can upgrade them faster, who can replace losses faster. That may sound less exciting than discussions about futuristic weapons. It is also arguably more important. A military doesn't fight with prototypes. It fights with whatever it can build in large numbers when the pressure arrives. Which brings us to the technology that triggered serious debate inside defense circles. Not because it looked futuristic, not because it generated dramatic headlines, but because it revealed something deeper about how quickly China's military-industrial machine is learning to turn advanced concepts into deployed capabilities. And once you understand what happened, the phrase, "Chinese military is weak," starts sounding less like analysis and more like a slogan. We'll get there in a moment. First, we need to examine the specific program that made a lot of people in Washington suddenly pay much closer attention. The program that caught so much attention wasn't important because it represented a single breakthrough. It was important because it exposed a pattern. A lot of people remember the headlines about China's hypersonic glide vehicle tests. Fewer remember what came afterward. the discussion quickly shifted from, "Did China really do this?" to, "How many other programs are further along than we thought?" That's a very different conversation. Military planners aren't frightened by one surprise. They're frightened by the possibility that the surprise wasn't isolated. Think about what happened over the last decade. China launched the world's largest navy by ship count. It expanded production of advanced destroyers. It accelerated aircraft carrier construction. It introduced the J-20 stealth fighter into operational service. It deployed increasingly sophisticated anti-ship missile systems designed specifically to complicate American operations in the Western Pacific. Any one of those developments would be notable. The fact that they happened simultaneously is what deserves attention. Because complex military systems compete for the same resources: engineers, skilled workers, specialized materials, research funding, testing facilities. Most countries hit bottlenecks. China kept moving. That doesn't mean every Chinese system is superior. Some aren't. The J-20, for example, still faces questions regarding engines, operational doctrine, and pilot experience compared with decades of American combat aviation development. Critics aren't inventing those concerns. But here's where I think many analyses become incomplete. They focus heavily on today's performance while paying less attention to tomorrow's production capacity. And military history repeatedly punishes that mistake. Before World War II, many observers viewed American industry as inefficient compared to European military establishments. Then war arrived. The United States produced aircraft, ships, vehicles, and munitions at a scale that fundamentally altered the conflict. The lesson wasn't that America had better equipment on day one. The lesson was that industrial capacity eventually became military power. Remember that. We're coming back to it. Because China's leadership certainly has. The Chinese government didn't wake up one morning and decide to build advanced weapons. The groundwork stretches back years. Programs such as the Made in China 2025 initiative drew enormous attention in Western capitals. Public discussions usually focused on economics, artificial intelligence, robotics, semiconductors, advanced manufacturing, electric vehicles. Yet many of those same technologies possess obvious military applications. A factory capable of producing advanced civilian electronics develops expertise that can contribute to military systems. A company working on autonomous driving software creates engineers who understand machine vision and AI. A nation investing heavily in semiconductor fabrication isn't just thinking about smartphones. The boundaries are becoming blurry. And that is exactly why modern military competition looks different from what many people expect. The decisive factories may not look military at all. A dry joke here. The 21st century has produced the unusual situation where a facility manufacturing electric vehicle components might indirectly matter to national security more than a facility producing tanks. That sounds ridiculous until you examine the supply chains. Then it starts making sense. This brings us to a company that rarely receives the same attention as missile programs or aircraft carriers. The Chinese drone manufacturer DJI. Now, DJI is not the Chinese military. Let's be precise. But its rise demonstrated something important. Chinese firms became capable of dominating entire technological sectors through scale, manufacturing efficiency, and rapid iteration. When conflicts erupted in places like Ukraine, commercial drones suddenly became essential tools on the battlefield. Surveillance, target acquisition, battle damage assessment, operational awareness. Capabilities that once required expensive military platforms were increasingly available through relatively inexpensive systems. The military lesson was obvious. Technological advantage isn't always about producing the most sophisticated device. Sometimes it's about producing enough capable devices quickly and cheaply. Quantity doesn't replace quality, but quantity has a habit of becoming its own form of quality. Military planners have known that for generations. What changed is the speed. And this is where the China is weak narrative starts running into trouble, because weakness usually doesn't look like this. Weak countries don't dominate industrial sectors across multiple advanced technologies. Weak countries don't produce naval tonnage at extraordinary rates. Weak countries don't generate growing pools of engineers every year. Weak countries don't force the Pentagon to repeatedly update threat assessments. None of that means China is unbeatable, far from it. Its military has genuine vulnerabilities. Its demographic challenges are real. Its economy faces serious structural pressures. Its forces lack recent large-scale combat experience. Those facts matter. But focusing only on weaknesses creates another kind of distortion, one that's becoming harder to defend as new systems continue appearing. And here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Because the most significant Chinese military advantage may not be hypersonic weapons. It may not be aircraft carriers. It may not even be artificial intelligence. The real advantage might be something far less glamorous, an ability to compress development cycles faster than many competitors believed possible. And if that's true, the implications stretch far beyond any single weapon system. They reach into the future of military competition itself. Because the next question isn't what China has deployed, it's how quickly it can deploy whatever comes next. Let's assume for a moment that the critics are right. Let's assume China's military still faces serious operational weaknesses, limited combat experience, questions about command flexibility, concerns over logistics under wartime pressure, potential vulnerabilities in overseas power projection. Those are not trivial issues. Wars have been lost by armies that looked unbeatable on paper. But here's the problem. Many discussions stop there, and by stopping there, they miss the shift that's actually underway. Because military competition is increasingly becoming a race between adaptation speeds rather than static capabilities. The country that learns fastest may eventually outperform the country that starts strongest. That's the reversal. The debate isn't really about whether China's military today is stronger than America's military today. The debate is whether the gap is closing faster than many Western planners expected. Those are entirely different questions. Think about smartphones. In the early 2000s, people laughed at many Chinese electronics manufacturers. Their products were viewed as cheap alternatives rather than serious competitors. A decade later, companies like Huawei, Xiaomi, and others were competing globally in advanced telecommunications, consumer electronics, and research-intensive industries. The lesson wasn't that China magically became innovative overnight. The lesson was that scale, iteration, and experience accumulated over time. Military technology follows a similar pattern. Not identical, but similar. A country builds a system, then improves it, then improves the process that improves the system. And that's where things become difficult to measure. Everyone can see a new fighter jet. Few people pay attention to how long it took to design, test, manufacture, and deploy that fighter jet. The process often matters more than the platform. Consider artificial intelligence. Much of the public conversation focuses on chatbots and image generators. Military planners see something else: target recognition, electronic warfare, logistics optimization, autonomous systems, decision support, battlefield awareness. None of those applications make dramatic headlines, yet collectively they can influence how effectively military forces operate. China has invested heavily in these areas for years. The United States has too. This isn't a one-sided story. In fact, America still possesses enormous advantages in software ecosystems, advanced research institutions, alliance networks, and military experience. That's the strongest counterargument, and it's a serious one. The United States isn't standing still while China advances. Far from it. American defense firms remain among the most sophisticated on Earth. American universities continue producing world-class research. The Pentagon still commands unmatched global operational experience. Anyone predicting imminent American military collapse is selling fantasy. I don't buy it, but I also don't buy the opposite fantasy. The idea that China's advances are mostly propaganda. Because at some point, the evidence pile gets too large. A navy doesn't appear through propaganda. Semiconductor facilities don't emerge through propaganda. Advanced missile systems don't emerge through propaganda. Thousands of engineers don't emerge through propaganda. Reality eventually demands recognition. And there's another number worth examining. China graduates hundreds of thousands of engineers and STEM students every year. The exact figures vary depending on methodology, but the scale is enormous. That doesn't mean every graduate becomes a genius inventor. That's not the point. The point is volume. If innovation is partly a numbers game, then large talent pools matter a lot. Remember the industrial ecosystem we discussed earlier? This is part of it. Factories need engineers. Research labs need engineers. Defense contractors need engineers. AI companies need engineers. The system feeds itself. And here's something I suspect we'll look back on years from now. Many analysts may have spent too much time comparing individual platforms while underestimating the ecosystem producing those platforms. The missile gets attention. The manufacturing base producing hundreds of missiles receives a fraction of that attention. The aircraft carrier gets attention. The shipyards capable of continuously expanding fleets receive less. The drone gets attention. The industrial network producing components, batteries, sensors, and software receives even less. Yet that's where long-term power often lives. Not in a single breakthrough, in the ability to generate breakthroughs repeatedly. One short observation. Countries can purchase weapons. They can't quickly purchase ecosystems. Building those takes decades. Which brings us back to the title. The claim isn't that China has already surpassed the United States across every military category. The evidence doesn't support that. The more interesting possibility is that some of the assumptions underlying the "China is weak" narrative are becoming outdated. Not because China solved every problem, because the nature of military competition itself is changing. And if that's true, then the biggest story isn't the technology China deployed yesterday. It's what that deployment reveals about where the next decade may be heading. Let's go back to the assumption we started with. China's military is weak. Like many popular narratives, it contains a piece of truth. China does lack certain advantages the United States enjoys. It lacks America's alliance network, stretching from Europe to the Pacific. It lacks decades of recent combat experience. It lacks hundreds of overseas military facilities supporting global operations. If tomorrow's competition were judged solely by those factors, the discussion would be much simpler. But that's not the competition we're watching. The competition we're watching is increasingly about industrial capacity, technological adaptation, and the speed at which new capabilities move from laboratories into operational service. That's a different contest, and it rewards different strengths. Remember the question from the beginning. How did China get here? Not to a position of dominance, to a position where serious military planners can no longer dismiss its progress as temporary or superficial. The answer isn't one missile. It isn't one aircraft. It isn't one breakthrough. It's accumulation, year after year, factory after factory, research institute after research institute, shipyard after shipyard. Many Western observers spent years asking whether China could innovate. China spent those same years building the infrastructure necessary to innovate repeatedly. Those are not the same thing, and that distinction matters. Because military competition in the 2030s may look very different from military competition in the 1990s. For decades, the United States could often rely on a substantial technological lead, develop a capability, deploy it, maintain an advantage for years, sometimes decades. That window appears to be shrinking. The cycle is accelerating. Technologies diffuse faster, manufacturing scales faster, research spreads faster, competition moves faster. The side that adapts quickest may enjoy more success than the side that merely invents first. That's the possibility keeping defense planners awake. Not a single Chinese weapon. A Chinese system that appears increasingly capable of learning, producing, and deploying at scale. Notice something important. Throughout this entire discussion, we've barely talked about a hypothetical war. That's intentional, because focusing only on war often causes people to miss what's happening beforehand. Military power is usually built long before it's tested. The foundations are laid quietly, the headlines arrive later. And I think we're living through one of those periods, a period where the underlying foundations are shifting faster than public perception. Some people still imagine China as the manufacturing hub of 20 years ago, excellent at producing things designed elsewhere. That image is becoming harder to reconcile with reality. Others have swung too far in the opposite direction, treating every Chinese announcement as proof of inevitable supremacy. That doesn't fit reality either. The truth is less dramatic and more significant. China is not an unstoppable military giant. China is not a weak military power. China is a rapidly evolving military-industrial competitor whose trajectory deserves serious attention. That's a more boring sentence. It's also probably closer to the truth. My own view is straightforward. I think many analysts are focusing too heavily on today's balance of power and not enough on tomorrow's rate of change. History has a habit of surprising people who assume current advantages are permanent. The British Empire learned that. The Soviet Union learned that. Every great power eventually learns that. And here's my prediction. Over the next decade, the most important military stories won't be about a specific missile, aircraft, or warship. They'll be about production, supply chains, semiconductors, artificial intelligence, industrial ecosystems, the things that sound boring right up until they determine the outcome. Which brings us back to that claim that China's military is weak. A weak military doesn't force the Pentagon to rewrite assumptions. A weak military doesn't trigger billions of dollars in new defense initiatives. A weak military doesn't become the central focus of strategic planning across the Indo-Pacific. You can argue that China remains behind in key areas. There is evidence for that. You can argue that America retains enormous advantages. It does. What becomes harder every year is arguing that China's rise can be dismissed. That argument is aging poorly. And if current trends continue, historians may eventually conclude that the most consequential military development of this era wasn't a weapon at all. It was the construction of an industrial machine capable of turning ideas into capability, faster than much of the world expected. If that happens, the debate won't be whether China was weak. The debate will be why so many people kept saying it was. If you enjoyed this analysis, subscribe and stick around. The stories shaping the next decade are usually visible long before they become obvious. Sometimes they're hiding in plain sight, right between the headlines and the factories.